Welcome everybody to this Common Press hosted event, which is a kind of an online launch for Palestine Minus One, which is a phenomenal anthology which we've been so proud to be part of and to have brought together. Tonight, or this afternoon, if you're in the US, we're delighted to be joined by the editor Basma Ghalayini and three of the contributors, George Abraham, Ibtisam, Azem, and Lina, Meruane. Apologies for my mispronunciations throughout. My name is Rob Page. I'm the founder of Common Press. I just thought I'd introduce everybody very, very briefly, and then ask the three authors to read some very, very short sections, and then we'll talk. And if anybody wants to ask any questions in the chat, please do so. So just to introduce everyone, Basma Ghalayini is a Gaza-born translator from the Arabic and editor who also works at Comma Press. She moved to the UK when she was 27, and she spent a few years in her very early childhood in the UK. She has translated for the Commonwealth Writers Association and various other places, including Comma. George Abraham is a Palestinian-American poet. Their debut collection, Birthright, won the George Allen Bogan Poetry Prize and was a finalist in the Lander Literary Award for Bisexual Poetry. With Noor Hindi, George co-edited Heaven Looks Like Us, a Palestinian poetry, which was longlisted for the 2025 Book Awards. Ibtisam Azem is a novelist and journalist based in New York. She grew up in Taipei, near Jaffa, the city from which her mother and maternal grandparents were internally displaced in 1948. She has published two novels in Arabic, The Sleep Thief and The Book of Disappearance, the latter of which have been translated into numerous languages and been longlisted for the International Booker Prize. Her first short story collection, City of Strangers, has appeared in Arabic just a few months ago, in 2025. And finally, we're joined by Lina Meruane, who is a Chilean Palestinian writer and scholar. She has authored two collections of short stories and five novels translated into 12 different languages. She has written several non-fiction books, including the memoir Palestine in Pieces. She has received numerous awards, including, just to list three, the Blue Metropolis Award, the Palermo Award, and the Anna Sagers Prize. Thank you all for joining us, and sorry for me rushing through and garbling your bios. But I thought I'd start by just asking each of you to just read a short passage from your stories for this anthology. Palestine Minus One is a kind of a prequel to a previous book that Basma edited for Comma called Palestine Plus 100. There, the stories will set 100 years after the Nakba, and here the idea is to ask writers to set their stories just before and then during and after the immediate aftermath of the Nakba. Ibtisam, I thought I'd ask you to read a short section first, if that's okay.
Yes, sure. Thank you for the introduction and thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here with everyone else, with George, Lina, and Basma, and with you. I will start by like few lines in Arabic because it was written in Arabic. And then I will move to the translation, also very short. شددت إسماعيل من يده وتركنا الجامع خلفنا وهربنا نحو بيتنا كي لا يصطادوننا. ارتعشت أصابعه الرفيعة بين أصابع المتوترة. بدا وكأن ساقيه لا يستطيعان حمل جسده النحيف. سحبته بقوة أكثر كي يترك خطاه المتعثرة خلفه. خفت أن تفلت يده من يدي من شدة تعرقها. هل هذا العرق الذي كان ينزل كشلال ماء هو من خوفه أم إنه لجهنم تموز؟ قيظ لم أرى مثله في حياتي. قالت أمي إن تموز ذلك العام كان أشد حرا من جهنم. ضحك أبي عندما سمعها وقال: شو بعرفك كنت بجهنم؟ لكن أمي كانت على حق، وأدركنا بعدها أننا كنا في جهنم اللد، جهنم فلسطين، دون أن ندري. إسماعيل اللداوي, translated by Rana Asfour. I squeezed Ismail's hand, and with the mosques behind us, we ran home to avoid being caught. His slender fingers trembled in my tight grip as his legs fought to support his delicate frame. I tugged him closer, worried his clammy hand may slip from mine. Was the steady stream of sweat due to fear, or the sweltering heat of July, a heat like of which I had never experienced before? When my mother remarked that this July felt hotter than hell, my father had laughed and said, "How would you know? Have you ever been?" But my mother was right. We had unwittingly found ourselves in Lud's hell, the hell of Palestine, without even realizing it. My mother always says that prayer offered with the first drops of rain are sure to be granted. And so it was that 8 months prior, on the eve of the feast of Saint George al-Khidr, the revered patron of Lud, at the first gentle drop of rain fell, as the first gentle drops of rain fell, I stood gazing up at the sky, pleading with Al-Khidr to watch over us and keep us safe in Lud. And he did, yet nothing within us has remained unscathed. I asked Ismail whether Al-Khidr was hard of hearing. Otherwise, how could he keep us in lid, but allow everything in and around us to be destroyed? Ismail and I hastened, keeping pace with our terror. The streets were now trapped where hunters hungered for our flesh, aiming their guns at anything that moved. That day has remained etched in my memory, alongside the haunting absence of Ismail's voice. I had assumed this silence would be temporary, just a reaction to the present moment. I never imagined it would take decades before I would hear him speak again today, for the first time, more than 70 years after he seemingly swallowed his voice whole on 11th of July, 1948. Thank you.
Shukran, Ibtisam. Uh, Lina, would you like to read a short passage? Thank you.
So I'll read very briefly. The oldest and frailest among us pulled the device from his tattered pocket. It was a cell phone, glinting in the sun. Closing his eyes, he raised it towards the smoke-orange sky, as if offering a sacrifice to the gods of diaspora. But he wasn't making an offering at all. He was looking for a signal that might serve as a compass. His trembling hand, still uplifted, succeeded, and his clumsy fingers typed pa, then less, then tine. And his screen lit up with innumerable Palestinian points across the globe. Palestine, he exclaimed. Palestine, we cried, confused but excited. There were countless Palestines scattered over the planet, and we were able to name them, rejoice in them, even though among ourselves the name was Palestine. That name had been stifled in our mouths. We had silenced it on our lips and in our bones. Our children had never heard us whisper it, and now we could pronounce every letter. Now we saw it twinkling like innumerable stars on a virtual map. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Um, I should say, obviously, Ibtisam's story started in 1948. Lina's is very much jumps to the present. And George, your story is also rooted or starts in the present at least. Would you like to read
Yeah.
us a little passage? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll read one of the bathhouse kind of time glitches. I think yeah, time glitch is kind of the operative mode. So I mainly write horror, and I was
Ah,
just like I refuse to write a Nakba story where the Palestinian body is brutalized. That is just my number one premise for entering this story. And so I'm like, cool, so I'm writing a settler body instead. And so this is a story that takes place on the 6th of October, 2023, from the POV of a white gay Israeli settler who makes Aliyah and is living, laughing, and loving in Tel Aviv and until the horror comes. So he at this point it's established that he um, skipped his military contract by instead becoming a spy, spying on Palestinians through gay dating apps for the Zionist entity, and he is taking a day of rest and relaxation in the bathhouse. Needless to say, the bathhouse had become a familiar habitat for me. The workers know me on a first name basis, and today, like all days of rest and relaxation, they would roll out the red carpet and prepare my special oversized robe and comfy XL slippers, the ones I'd slip my feet into like a fetish, before leading me to my special full-size locker number 47, where I would get out of my clothes immediately. I would shower and enter the gray tiled room, starting with the lukewarm bath, which watching the water slightly overflow the pool's rim. Israel, in my experience, is a country of time, a country in which time is always in the room, hovering at the margins of every social interaction. For a country whose largest national hobby is archaeology, time is not merely the ground we walk on, it structures every room we move through. The baths, on the other hand, are the exact opposite. They're the only place I can escape time, give my mind permission to wander. It's easy to forget I have a self in this country, buried beneath the rubble of my daily multilingual clowning, this corporate circus act that I call my working life. Across the room, an Arab emerges from the showers. The pink tip of his cock hangs just below his sack, flopping up and down as he walks with the casual recklessness of living in a country you're only half committed to. I want him, which is to say, just a bit to taste. I follow him into the sauna. The steam so thick the room feels infinite. I walk forward, and I do not see the Arab, nor the usual terraced wall of men sitting in their small hierarchies of dick and mouth. Hello? I shout. My English betrays me. I turn back towards the door only to realize there is no door. The floor beneath me, not the gray tiled spreading out like a development project, but a slick limestone. Fuck it, I say. This is the most interesting thing to happen to me all year as I walk onwards into the mist. I try not to think too hard about it all. As I walk, I dream of wandering into an Arab, no, two, no, a whole country of them, in a never-ending orgy to which I am invited. I dream of parting their sea of hands, of being touched and tongued at every orifice by a different man. In the dream, the men are wearing nothing but headscarves. Their eyes are stone, their fingers half curled in primordial want. I get hard in my dreaming. I get closer, closer, closer until that fucking noise again, there it comes, like metal cutting through the trom-com of my daydreaming. The steam begins to spiral around me, the particles condensing, coalescing into a small vortex, and for the first time, visibility. I am not in the room of a bathhouse. I am nowhere. The floor is stone and the walls are non-existent. There is just me and the vortex growing, growing, growing as my boner exsanguinates itself. I look down at my smartwatch, rub the steam off, and the year is stuck on 1947, the time spinning off in all directions. As the vortex absorbs more and more steam, it begins to whisper. The whisper becomes an airy roar, its tone descending from some depths of some hell. Off about 100 yards behind me, the steam has cleared enough for me to see a door, a modern and upright, connected to no walls, a glitch in the ancient landscape. I run towards it, and the vortex descends onto me, wailing, cutting the air between us. I can almost feel it, reaching as if it too were hands that wanted to unmake me. I barrel into the door and fling it open, only to fall first into the floor of the bathhouse. Across the room, the Arab, who had become two Arabs, shifts their gaze to me for the first time. I get myself up, wondering if my faceplant has caused a nosebleed, and the Arabs turn their gaze away, perhaps out of compassion not to engage whatever spectacle I had become, perhaps out of utter indifference. I turn back to the sauna door, still open and leaking steam. The room had completely assumed its normal form of terraced walls, completely empty.
Thank you, George. Um, Three really, really different kind of stories and perspectives and vistas on the current moment and vantage points. I just wanted to kind of rewind a little bit and just ask you all where your stories came from, where your ideas came from, why you made the decisions you did. But before we do that, I just wanted to ask Basma, what was the thinking behind this particular book for you, and what did you want to kind of get out of it?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your wonderful readings. It's always nice to hear the stories from the writers. It just gives it that different echo. The thinking behind Palestine Minus One came at the beginning of the genocide, really. We were driving to and from work feeling absolutely helpless, like everybody else at the very beginning. We couldn't listen to music, we couldn't listen to anything. So for me, I started listening at the beginning of any onslaught on Gaza. I always found myself defaulting to educating myself because as a Gazan, you're suddenly finding yourself in the accusation corner where everyone's going to be coming to you, asking you, why are you being attacked? Why are you being massacred? Finding yourself needing to explain to everybody, explain this to everybody and educate them. So I find myself at the beginning of every onslaught defaulting to educating myself. So at the very beginning of the genocide, I was listening to Ilham Pape's ethnic cleansing of Palestine in a way to preempt any kind of questions I'll get about the history of it all. And Ilham Pape systematically in this book goes village to village explaining how the ethnic cleansing started. And I just thought it would be a good idea to have a fiction book, horror inspired, we could ask the writers to talk about the villages their grandparents came from, but through the speculative horror lens. And that was the first reason. That's the first way Palestine Minus One came about, just as a way to another angle to explain the history of a Nakba to everybody or the readers, or to trick them into learning about it. We'd already done science fiction with Palestine Plus 100, and we thought the best way to explain trauma would be through horror, because one of our writers, Hassan Balasim, he was the editor of Iraq Plus 100. He was interviewed once, and he was asked, "How do you talk about horror? How do you explain horror or violence in such a surreal way?" And he scoffed at the question, because he'd explained that if anyone who experienced trauma or violence would understand that it's very surreal experience, an out of body experience, and the only way to explain to the experience of being subjected to such an amount of violence is through a horror genre or a surrealist genre. So we thought that Palestine Minus One, the stories can explain the violence of the occupation and of the Palestinian history through those stories. That would be the best way to explain what the Palestinians are going through and the violence that they were subjected to through the horror genre.
Thank you. Ibtisam, where did your story come from? And in your bio, I know your family's from Jaffa, but you chose Lid. Why did you choose that particular city and that particular massacre?
Yeah. I mean, my maternal family, my grandparents from my maternal side are from Jaffa, and they were displaced within 48 territories. Well, the Book of Disappearance was about Jaffa, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't write another book or another story that also talks about Jaffa and other places. But the lid was actually on my mind for longer, for a different subject, for the novel that I'm working on now, which has to do with the violence, internal, like the mafia, the drugs, how the settler colonial system, the Israeli is the organized crime, etc. And it's not only Lud that I research, but it's also Taibe, where I grew up, where also these problems are very present, and then Jaffa and other places. So for a while, I have been working on reading more and more about Jaffa and about Lid. But one of the things that, so when you guys approached me, and I just happened that also in 2023, in June or May, I was with Palfist, and part of how Palfist like function on the ground, that they also do different trips to different Palestinian cities, and one of these trips was Lid. And one of the people who the guide was talking about the issue of how a large part of Lid actually kind of not disappeared, but a lot of neighborhoods now are under like park floods and all these things. And by going and I went back and I read again about Lud, and Lud is very interesting because it was one of the Palestinian cities that fought strongly, and where the Zionists also went against the Haganah and the other groups. And Lod was not only important because it's central, it's a city, but also because the way the massacres happened there, and it was part of the so-called the D or the Dan plan, which was adopted in March. And it's a plan by the Haganah and others to basically displace and empty Palestinian, specifically coastal and Palestinian cities. And Lod played an important role when it came to train, the airports, all these things. So I wanted to stay there because I feel like we do talk about villages, and it's important as part of what's happened in the Nakba. But I wanted to stay also with Lid because what did happen there was on a level that somehow crystallized and summarized in a way, if we can say that at all, also the history of the Nakba in a brutal way.
Thank you. Um, Lina, you came at this from a very different sort of perspective. You came at it from the sort of the global diaspora point of view. Where did your story or how did your story come together for you?
Well, first of all, thank you. I didn't say thank you at the beginning. I was just a little nervous. But thank you so much for
Thank
you've
you.
been so committed. Kama has been so committed in following through with publications about Palestine and with Palestinians from throughout the world. And that's really my case. I'm from Chile. I belong to the diaspora that actually came a century ago into Latin America. This is the largest diaspora outside of the Arab world, maybe a million people that mixed throughout. So it's hard to count how many people we actually are. And it is the case of my grandparents on my father's side, who were the people who came from Beit Jala. And so, as I think about the question of Palestine, I sometimes think that the diaspora is an important part of that story, because in the case of Beit Jala, there's more people outside of Beit Jala in Chile than in Beit Jala itself. And it's part of the story that often doesn't get told for good reasons, right? Because it's the people who basically saved themselves from this amount of violence, of historical violence. But I have been thinking for a very long time about the possibility that the Zionist plan actually comes true and that the entire community is displaced or destroyed. And this is, of course, a thought that is a very scary and horrendous thought. But to sort of counter that fear and that sort of vertigo that I sometimes feel in these times, I started looking for Palestine on Google Earth. And to my surprise, there's many Palestines, many small towns and small places and big places called Palestine throughout. So to my surprise, there's like 6 cities in the United States, towns actually, and smaller towns in Colombia, and then cemeteries, and a street in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, which is surrounded by an avenue called the Republic of Israel, just kind of really strange, and so on and so forth. So I started thinking about all those Palestines and thinking that Palestine is everywhere. And that somehow gave me hope in moments of despair. So I tried to think about Palestinians having to leave Palestine with all the pain that that entails, but having a sort of hope by finding on this phone. This is why I just selected that very short piece, that there would be other places called Palestine to where they could go. And I think this was the dream of the very early Palestinians who went into the diaspora, which was to, for example, settle in a town in Chile that the legend goes reminded them of Beit Jala. So there is a sort of the hope in that story at the same time as the horror of seeing how the entire land disappears actually under the weight of the bombs. So there is like the two sides of this story.
Thank you. And George, your story comes at it from a very different perspective. It's very much well, its roots are in on October 7th. So yeah, talk us through your thinking behind your story.
I think just kind of, I mean, piggybacking off both of those beautiful answers too. I mean, having, my family's roots are from Ramallah and Jerusalem. And so, and I was only able to go back to Palestine once in my life. And actually, in doing that, my Sido was on the phone with me, and it wasn't even like the Jerusalem of his upbringing that made him excited. He was like, "Oh, you're gonna get to go to Haifa. You're gonna get to go to Jaffa. I haven't seen. I remember going to those cities as teenagers, and I haven't been able to see it since. I haven't been able to touch the sea, etc. And so just thinking about those sites of his own nostalgia that he has, been displaced from, right? And so I knew I wanted to write in, around that, which is called Tel Aviv now, because especially this whole disgusting pinkwashing gay capital of the Middle East, etc., nonsense is something I really wanted to hold alongside the, just utter there's like on one hand queer and trans insurgents we're seeing, especially in the US post October 7th, and I've in so many ways been much more optimistic about queer co-resistance with Palestinians for the first time kind of in like my life in a lot of ways. And at the same time within these collectives, there's always just that gay Zionist twink who's a man who's just like is ruining like the room or the discourse. And I'm like, okay, so I found my persona that I wanted to hone in on, this like Zio twink sort of demon persona. And starting from the premise of, okay, so I'm like, where is my settler? That's my second question. If I'm like, cool, I'm gonna write a horror story where the settler is brutalized, where is my settler? And then the second thing being like, there's a million horror stories, Nakba as horror, diaspora as horror, the entire, systematic annihilation of an entire people and culture as horror. And even further than that, there is in the today, the present tense, an entire settler society having cocktails over and dancing and in the proximity of that which is literally a concentration camp that they've turned Gaza into. And to me, the real horror story is to hold that mirror up to the settler society and be like, look, you are the people living, laughing, loving, dancing as you commit a genocide, very enthusiastically endorsing this genocide. There's time and time and time again, this settler society has shown that, despite the two leftists in their country, there is the vast majority, 87+% of them, enthusiastically endorse this genocide, and so I wanted to kind of embody that as the departure point, and then from therein, the question then can ask, sure, if I'm gonna induce this kind of horrific response in the settler reader, what then becomes of my Palestinian readers, right? And I guess for me, the question then becomes, especially the Palestinians in diaspora, right? Who do we become in diaspora? How do we replicate these settler dynamics in diaspora as well? Of course, this settler is a monstrous figure. I did not want to portray any Israeli gay person as in any way sympathetic. I didn't want to portray any kind of, the second we get a little bit of interiority, I'm like, nope, rein it back. These people don't have self-awareness, etc. And that was actually kind of a craft difficulty of writing this as a poet, especially is I really, really, really did not want to have any sympathy at all for my protagonist and or any justification for my protagonist. But in those kind of moments, what can I reveal to the diaspora? Like, no, actually, how in many ways is our normal life sitting, living, laughing, loving in America as we're funding the bombs, as we're funding the Zionist entity, etc. How is that actually in a fucked up way much more similar to the settler dynamic than it is to any kind of Palestinian experience, let alone a Palestinian in Gaza right now, right? And so to hold that mirror up even to our diaspora, because I'm thinking of like the sellout Ramallah side of my family who are just very comfortable in bourgeois kind of wealth and comfort, And so in a weird way, I also kind of wrote this story for them too, in trying to kind of make them that side of the very asleep side of the diaspora uncomfortable, not to, you know, because obviously most of our diaspora is really getting to work and getting, but then the question too is, the Nakba as a puncture in time, the Nakba as, this today, as everyone has said, is what we're witnessing in this genocide today is just the afterlife of Nakba. And so it's just the utter inability of, the willful, ignorance, and not even ignorance, but just the willful consumption of the delusion in the Western academic and media spheres that we can't even, we begin, quote unquote, our timeline at October 7th. Even that as a narrative construct is just vile and willfully, ahistoricized. And so how do we actually connect this moment of this quote unquote so-called October 7th moment actually to this entire history of Nakba? So that's another thing that my story was trying to think about in the slipperiness of time. And yeah, and so we can't write a Nakba story today without both, without the 48 and without, you know, obviously our Ghazawi kin right now.
Thank you. There is obviously kind of a lot of potholes, a lot of problems uh, with adopting any voice and appropriating any voice, and to say you're going to appropriate another culture's voice and you're going to deliberately avoid interiority is a very sort of brave decision because you know it's going to meet with a lot of flack. And just to put your story in context, George, for the viewers who've not read it. It does look at the character has various sort of time traveling glitches where they see these different moments, and it different moments in the kind of Palestinian struggle, whether it's the '67 war or 1948, or the build up to '48 or 1936, the Arab Revolt and so forth. And there's a moment in the end where he's at the Never Music Festival um, and he's kidnapped and he's slapped various times, and the character sort of glitches and his captive or his surroundings change, and the different insignia of the different resistance groups and different eras of resistance are portrayed there. Um, that's obviously that's obviously kind of a very contentious sort of set of decisions to make, starting with the appropriation of the voice, but then going through to this idea of pulling out October 7th and really rolling your sleeves up. Did you have any uh, trepidation about doing that?
Yeah, this short story took my entire summer to write. It was and a lot of it was neurosis. I mean, it was weird because I had to like create all these fake accounts on platforms to like research, what Zionists were thinking about during the Nova Festival and stuff without them infiltrating my algorithm because I'm like, I don't want any of the. So I created fake accounts under the pseudonym Yehuda Dajaj, and where I would go and like watch these Zionist documentaries. And so it's funny in a weird way how non-fictional this story is. Like a lot of the things, the absurdities of like the shit that these people say, they're actually kind of direct quotes from real people who are like at the festival and whatnot. And so yeah, no, Zionists are really just this, insipid anyways. And so in a way to portray them without any interiority wasn't that hard. Because like there's so much there's a wealth of an archive, sadly, of archiving their lack of humanity and interiority. But and the question of appropriation is interesting because on one hand I think about, you know, the early history of settler colonialism pre-Nakba. Like I think about the eras in which, if you look at like the Wasif Jawhariya archives and diaries, like thinking about during British Mandate rule, Zionists were coming and like trying to be like, no, look, teach me how to play the oud, teach me your embodied music traditions, teach me they really needed to study the native to become the native, right? And so the entire history of Zionism is one of literally hijacking our voices and taking over our entire lived realities and culture, from the inside out and performing a kind of, co-indigeneity with us, and that eventually became a replacement. We are the original indigeneity, et cetera, right? And so with that, I think about like Adenia Shibley's novel, for example, a minor detail that is the first half of it is written from a perspective of literally a member of the Haganah committing ethnic cleansing in 48. And this flatness, the sterileness of that voice and the haunting just mechanicalness on one hand, starkly contrasting to the contemporary Palestinian West Bank woman for the last half of the book. On one hand, I was thinking about that of like, how do I inhabit, right, this voice of a colonizer? But then again, thinking like, no, but my colonizer right now, the white gay man from Florida who makes Aliyah, um, that is a very, very different voice of colonizer. That is someone who tries to market themselves as a decent human being, someone who tries to, perform a certain kind of normalcy. And so how do I disrupt that but glitches? Every single day settler society is faced. If you are in 48, you see indigenous Palestinians every single day of your life in the margins of the person who makes your coffee or cleans up your work desk, or etc., or the taxi driver, or etc. The working class of Zionist settler society being super saturated with Palestinians and like Southeast Asian folks, and South Asian and African folks especially, but and so it sort of becomes also a class question, right, as well, of like where where is the settler forced to look at the fact that they are settler? That is kind of my question in this, and how could I use that as a starting point to kind of, you know, have Nakba enter the story, even if in traces and blips and fragments.
Thank you. I guess part of this is about throwing off perceived taboos. And what we perceive as a taboo is often what Palestinian perspectives perceive as a taboo is often just an internalized censor, and the colonizer's censor. And I'm thinking of your story, Ibtisam. In various points in your story, you use phrases like concentration camps. So it's set in a lid. A lot of it is set in a lid just after the Nakba, and it talks about the two ghettos of the remaining Palestinian community. There were over 40,000 Palestinians living in El Lid, and though that dwindled down to two camps of about 500 each. And you refer to them as concentration camps. You refer to them as ghettos. Um, you you have this image of the father of the narrator being forced to pick through the bloated corpses of the massacred to look for gold and jewelry to give to the invaders, to the occupiers, and all of these images obviously come with historical kind of resonances and connections, connections obviously to the Nazis, but all of these stories have, and you also talk about the Trail of Tears, which is very interesting because that's better known perhaps in the West as a Native American experience. So you're making comparisons all the time, which we're told we can't do and we shouldn't do. Do you feel that you wanted to? Was it sort of a conscious, deliberate effort, Ibtisam, to kind of make these connections for you?
I mean, for me, the connections, like even the concentration camp, I use it actually in the context, in the older context, because for me, it's important to remember that the issue of the Nakba and Zionism as a settler colonial movement started way before. And that's the context I used, because we have to remember actually concentration camps was used. This is the context I want to refer to, because it's important to refer to what's happening in Palestine as part of that colonial movement that came and occupied Palestine, from which, or colonized Palestine, and Zionism was part of it. That's one thing. The issue with the ghetto is actually Palestinians were saying that Israeli leaders, or the leaders of the Haganah, which became later Israeli leaders, were referring to these camps as ghettos, and no one believed them. But then we have in the 70s actually documents that came out from the archives that when they were talking about Lud and other places, that they themselves refer to them as ghettos. Like, this is the language they used. And also the issue, I think the last, and we have to remember also, and then I think somebody wrote, the Brits also use that in the quotes, and Nasser Abu Rahmi referred to that, and that's true. So it is for me important to put it in the larger context of the whole history, to what happened to Palestine. But Lud is very important, and maybe, and not only Lud, what happened in Palestinian coastal cities is that you had this very vibrant, very, including Lud. Lud had 20,000 inhabitants. And then during the Nakba times, 20 other thousand came as refugees. So there were around 20,000 after around 40,000 people until July 1948. So within basically 48 hours or even less, 39,000 were displaced. They were displaced mostly on foot. It was hot, it was Ramadan, and it was after the Dahmash mosque massacre. And I think it is important, and for me, the reference to this Native Americans is not to say, oh, we are the same, because each situation is different. I do believe that, but it's out of also respect and feeling of solidarity. And there, when you read, I went for this story and read a lot of also what George, similar to what George was describing, not only eyewitnesses from Palestinians who survived the massacre and survived the Lod Nakba, but also even from Israeli soldiers. And one of the striking things that was interesting, looting was happening all over Palestine. So it happened in Jaffa, it happened in other places, in the villages. But the interesting thing that it seems to be that looting and taking furniture out and gold and all this stuff happened on a scale in Lod that was way bigger than, at least this is what they will say, than before. And one of the interesting things that I was reading, and it was like by one of these Israeli soldiers who committed part of the massacre, was he was okay with the killing, but he found that the looting was actually unethical. And I was like reading this again and again. It's like, seriously. And it was for me, I needed to bring this back. And the fact that people had to go to march on foot, like literally to walk from Lid to Ramallah and sometimes to Jordan, and a lot of them did die on the road and were buried. So these are all really, yes, the two characters, the main characters are fiction, Ismail and his friend, but uh, all other aspects, even the way that what happened in the Dahmash mosque in the massacre, where 200 people were killed, or around 200, were based on all these research and readings. And the thing with Dahmash mosque is actually the crazy thing that the Israeli authorities had the mosque after the Palestinians, the 1,000 people who remained in two different camps for a whole year. And we have to remember that Palestinians who survived the Nakba and stayed in historic Palestine for 18 years, from 48 until 66. In most of the area, they were under military ruling, which meant they couldn't move freely as they wanted. They had to get permission from the authorities, etc. And in cities, it was for a year or something. But the mosque was closed until the 90s, with some of the blood that's still on the walls. So these are, like, when you read it, you think you are reading, that can't be true, but it is. And then this is where fiction starts, like, how can I, as a novelist or a fiction writer, bring this to life in a way that it's not only bringing the stories back, but also putting it in a context that people can also actually understand what did really happen there. What did it mean for the people who survived? What did it mean for the people who were forced to flee and became refugees and living with these memories? Yeah.
Thank you. Lina, your story talks a lot about language and the fact that and an identity in the fact that it's so fragmented, and the Palestinian identity is sort of scattered around the world. And you talk about even the word homeland, which is al balad in one pronunciation, or el eblad in another. Even the word for home has been fragmented and differs according to what part of Palestine you're from. I just wondered how, I mean, this is a kind of impossibly difficult question to ask, but how does a literature of can we speak of a Palestinian literature, it being so fragmented, and how does it hold itself together in such circumstances, against such sort of dispersal and division?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that, but as you were speaking, I was thinking that there is not only the question of literature as representation, but also the question of language. I myself don't speak Arabic. So how can I hold myself up to thinking of me as a Palestinian writer? And I struggle with that because, on the one hand, I've been accepted as a Palestinian in the diaspora, but then also I have been rejected as a Palestinian, as somebody who can speak of the Palestine question, because, as one Palestinian scholar told me, I did not have the experience of suffering which defines Palestinianness. I was struck by that in this conversation. Fortunately, there was another Palestinian scholar who stood up and said, "We Palestinians are not defined only by suffering, and the diaspora is, in any case, an experience of displacement and suffering, especially when one considers that, for example, my grandfather, when he had the money and bought a ticket for himself and my grandmother and wanted to travel back to visit and maybe to stay, the 1967 war broke out and they never returned. So, it's a difficult question to think about, but I have decided, and I see George's face of horror and distaste about what I'm saying. I have decided that I do think that I can tell a part of the story from the diaspora, from the Latin American diaspora, about the suffering of my grandparents and what happened to all the family, and also about the very difficult situation that we're living now, because also that diaspora has its own settler and capitalist ideology that they have taken for themselves as trying to be successful, right? And becoming capitalists and becoming right-wing people, and somehow also becoming part of a Zionist ideology, which, of course, this is difficult to say, but there are a lot of contradictions there. But let me return to the question of literature. So can a Palestinian literature that is so fragmented be considered a Palestinian literature? I think that the question is more political, or the answer is more political than literary. And what I mean by this is that there is no such thing as a national literature that is sort of, it's all equal to each other. Like we're not writing the same story. We're not writing from the same point of view. We're not writing in the same language. And so there is no like generational or national thing to it. But I do feel that there is a thinking of Palestine which unites Palestinian writers from within and without. And that, I think, is, and the need to establish that and keep that going is, or responds to a political need. I do think that we need to call ourselves Palestinian writers because we're thinking of Palestine and we want to oppose colonialism, annihilation, Zionism, and you name it. But that doesn't mean that that literature is going to be written in the same tone, with the same ideas in the background or in the same languages. It's a sort of an extended community. It's a diverse community that has a political struggle ahead of itself.
Thank you. And I should also say this is a question. If anybody else wants to sort of chip in and talk, I know these are questions that exercise you, Basma, a lot as well in terms of your identity, and how much you, as somebody who grew up in Gaza and then moved away, how much you've struggled with the fact that you don't feel as Gazan or as Palestinian as people back home.
Yeah, no, I was 100% finding myself relating to everything that Lina said, or a lot of it, because I came to Manchester in 2008, just before the 2008-2009 onslaught happened. It happened just after I left. And then there was 2012, 2014, and so on. And with every single onslaught happening, whereas my mum's house was in Gaza. The bedroom I grew up in, my grandparents' house, all places I grew up in, all my memories of those places, all there, very vivid. Yet after I left and all those onslaughts took place, I was being told, "Oh no, you don't get it. You don't get it. You've been." It's almost like those there was a divergence that happened as I left that made me less Gazan because I didn't witness all of those onslaughts, and I was carrying a lot of struggle and guilt from that, and I was being made to feel guilty, and in a way, I did blame myself, but also I realized that suffering takes all shapes and forms, and one of them is survivor's guilt. And thinking about your family back home and how you absolute helplessness towards anything. And in my opinion, one of the biggest factors that makes a Palestinian is that urge or that pull towards the land, towards the place. Whether or not you visited it, it's in your DNA in a way. You just feel it running through your veins. So as much as it's a different kind of suffering, it is very difficult to have that feeling and live with it every single day, that just feeling that you are living here in the UK, but just to avoid being cheesy, but your mind and soul and heart are elsewhere. And I think on every level, on different levels, every Palestinian in the diaspora will have those feelings, whether or not they've ever stepped foot in Palestine,
Mm-hmm.
And I just, that's my take on the matter.
Thank you. Ibtisam, your story talks about this character Ismail, who witnesses the massacre, the Damash mosque in Alud. When he's 10 years old, he loses his mother and his grandmother. He watches them being killed, and then he loses his voice, or he effectively loses his voice, and he's silenced. And you have a line about the world silenced him, even though he wasn't technically mute. And he lives through countless anniversaries of the 11th of July massacre. He witnesses the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who's one of the military commanders who oversaw the Al massacre. And he witnesses the genocide in Gaza, and with each new loss, he sort of deteriorates more and more, especially with the genocide. But then something happens in late January 2025, where he sees the march of people returning, walking up the Al Rashid Road, the beach road, from the south to the north, and it's the first glimmer of any kind of return, the return that the refugees of the Nakba never saw in their lifetimes or haven't seen since. And he suddenly finds his voice again, and he even sings at the very end of the story. And it feels like that's your hope for, in as much as we can have any hope or take anything positive out of the genocide. It feels like that's your kind of you're trying to will this into being what the genocide does at very least, which is to give Palestine its voice back when its history has been suppressed, it's been erased. Was that kind of one of your intentions with that character story?
Yes, yes, it was. And it was also, during writing the story, and I was late in submitting, and it did happen that I wasn't sure how I want to end it. Like I had several ends and I was conflicted. And then that return happened, and I knew it's only for a very short period. But there was this strength that you could see without being too trying to romanticize or but there was something that was for me important to bring back and to remember, really, if we put what's happened in Palestine in the larger context from the Nakba or before that until today, despite all these powers, despite all what is happening, still, Palestinians didn't give up on their rights, their dreams, and there was something about singing and pleasure, and this is why I made this character as somebody who had a very special voice, but he lost it because he was so overwhelmed. And to be honest, as you said at the beginning, I work as a journalist and I cover the UN and American foreign policy, and to sit there in these press rooms day in and day out and to listen to back then under Biden, all these politicians, including Biden, um, basically denying the numbers of Palestinians who were killed, despite the fact that the UN was saying actually not only that the numbers are correct, but probably they are underestimation, and this is only verified numbers of people who were killed in the genocide. And there was something about having a voice as a journalist and sitting in these press conferences and having to ask because, when you're a person of color and then let alone Palestinian, yes, you can show your anger if you want, etc., but you have to stick to facts, to check your facts, because any minor details could put your so there was something, despite sitting in these press conferences and feeling that I have my voice and I can ask these questions and challenge, etc. But there was something very also when I leave these play rooms that made me suffocate constantly. And I was feeling, and this is where the idea also then started, like him, the main character, losing his voice, and then because also the world was not actually listening to him, and then he decided to not give up, and he goes and start taking the signs down, because if you go today in front of the Dahmash mosque, there is a place, and they named the place after the militant group that killed the Palestinians in the mosque. So, this is like you were talking about, I think George or maybe Lina, I can't remember, about the daily life of Palestinians of 48, that you have to go every day through all these microaggressions, or I wouldn't even call them microaggressions. Basically, you are witnessing constantly 24/7 what does it mean to be colonized. And I wanted to bring that from the perspective. But I want to say something about that Lina and was saying, and your question about fragmentation. And, I think sometimes, why do we expect even Palestinian literature to be one thing? Like, what do we ask this question when it comes to British literature, American literature, or other kind of literature? Isn't it normal that we have all these different, yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask a question about sort of the role of the writer in a sort of really generic kind of way. We talk about erasure and silencing of Palestinian voices and the erasure of this history from a non-fictional point of view, and obviously the importance of testimony and record keeping and archiving and chronicling and retelling of non-fiction history is really it's really obvious how important that is. But what's the importance for you as fiction writers? What can fiction do in the recapture or the preservation of history?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can chime in here to answer that with just dovetailing off of, again, all those beautiful responses. Because the body of Palestinian literature is a many in one body politic, right? You can't write about Palestinian literature today without thinking about Arabic, without thinking about English, without thinking about Spanish, without thinking about Hebrew, without, translinguistic, transnational, and so to me, the kind of, again, just really having very similar experiences within myself, asking myself about, as what is my use in diaspora, as kind of, Lina and Basma were talking about, and then that survivor's guilt. The question that's really gotten me through that, especially the last few years, has been, who am I really responsible to? And so that's kind of my answer, I think, to Ra's question, right? The question of what the writer's use is who am I as a writer responsible to, and how am I directing in my daily life, not just on the page, but in my daily life, in my teaching, in my, local politics work, in my public intellectual work, in every single aspect. How am I centering the people I'm most responsible to? I teach at a very, very elite, private, horrific school that is built on indigenous land theft and horrendously is openly profiting from multiple genocides, including Palestinian genocides, right? And so to me, then, that endows me with a responsibility to, how do I betray that wealth, that power? How do I hijack, redistribute that wealth and that power? How do I, you know, when in at a day-to-day level, I don't wake up and think, my my schedule is determined by my university and that is where my allegiance. No. I think I look at my Signal, I look at my WhatsApp, I look at my, what fires do I need to put out for Mizna? What fires, who needs like the most urgent support right now in my community? And then the other things come later, and just I think that all of us in diaspora have differentially reacted and changed ourselves to this, post October 7th moment. I don't know a single Palestinian who hasn't undergone a major, change. But I think for me, the thing that changed is that the masks are all off. I can't pretend to even have an allegiance to this country or any of these institutions. My allegiance is to my people. And the second I lose sight of that, cool, I need to leave this job, or I need to leave this whatever, and so what we can change about ourselves is how we orient ourselves with respect to these structures and these systems, and who we prioritize in our daily lives, who we give our attention to, who we give our labor to, right? And so for me, one of the roles, quote unquote, of the writer is to model that, going back to Adonis and the big arguments in El Shad, after the Nakba, thinking about, no, maybe one of the great roles of literary people is to model how to be a responsible, ethical human being, truly, to our community. And again, for me, that really just has to show up beyond the page. That doesn't, the work on the page is a starting point, not an end point. And I hate that a lot of American writers view that as, oh, my art is my activism, my art, no. Go do something in the world. Sorry, it's like that's a cop out. You can't just stop there. Um, And then for me too, in a weird way, kind of semi-unintentionally, reading from this short story at various places. Like, I read this at Jordy Rosenberg's book launch. I read this story because I was helping him edit his novel Night Night Fawn, which is his voice in the derogatory Zionist transphobic mother like novel. I was helping him edit that novel as I was writing this short story, funnily enough. And so and him and his partner Jaspir Kapoor, who's one of the greatest theorists, queer and disability justice theorists alive on this planet right now. And reading this story out loud at that at Jordy's book launch to the two of them, especially, it's a kind of almost a performance artwork in a way. There are very few places in the US I can safely read this story aloud, truly, without instantly just like getting fired from my job. And so with the danger that comes to it, I'm like, I'm oddly more invested in this fiction project because it's dangerous, especially as a poet, as kind of an outsider to this question. But B, now it's so interesting because as I'm kind of writing into this to make it into a novel, I'm actually really interested in the various receptions people will have because I'm really interested in the spectacle that Palestinian Western academics, especially in the US, have become post October 7th, this weird condemn Hamas industrial complex that we're living in. And as if it's anything but a betrayal to condemn people breaking out of a concentration camp, let alone, again, internal critiques of Hamas, etc. That's a very different conversation than you're in the public, condemn your own people, please, before you can be granted access, right, to these institutions. And so I kind of am interested in the way this story can, at a microcosm, function as like when people have loved it and hated it, it's been very, very telling in either direction, actually. And just kind of cataloging and recording these reactions is kind of what I'm doing as I move forward into the novel. Seeing Palestinian friends of mine texting me at 3 a.m, like, I was up all night reading your story, it was making me laugh my ass off, etc. Versus like white academic number 72 that's like, I'm gonna go out of my way to condemn this October 7th story in my illiterately written review of this book, etc. And it's great because again, the story holds that mirror up to these people to be like, do you read Palestinian literature as just a document of annihilation, or can you see us again as a many in one body politic that are doing worlds of things in all of our literatures across each other? So maybe the also meta function of this is to join, say, hey, we're part of a collective, and maybe writing is one way of telling people, look, this is what it means to be accountable and responsible to a collective of people. And yeah.
Lina, you had your hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, because will have to leave in like the next 10 minutes. But
By the way, if anybody's got any questions, please put them in the chat now.
yeah,
Go
I'm
on.
sorry about that. But I was listening to George and also to Ibtisam and Basma, and I was thinking about the word suffocation, right? I was just trying to imagine the feeling, and suffocation is also guilt, right? And survival guilt and not being there. And I think that there's something to be said about what literature does in regards to this sort of suffocation, where also George was talking about this, right? Condemn your people, don't speak, don't be angry, right? And the question of anger is so dehumanizing to tell someone who is the victim or part of the community that has been annihilated to not be angry. And this really reminds me of a fabulous essay by Mohammed Al-Kurd, Perfect Victims, where he really looks into this paradox where Palestinians who have had their entire families killed have to sort of feel that they're pressured to say, but I'm not angry, right? But I'm just in pain, but I don't hate anybody. There's no hate. And it's like, and El Kurd asks, well, how would it be possible that you're not in pain and angry right? About not only about what's happening, but by the reaction of people, by the sort of interrogation of our political position in regards to what has been happening in front of everybody's eyes, right? And that's a form of dehumanization, in my view, because anger is also human. So I think that literature also allows us to speak because somehow the trick in fiction is that one can have more liberty, more space to speak about complexity and the entire range of feelings that characters experience. So I think that there's something important there that is sort of a letting go of that sense of suffocation um, that I think everybody who's Palestinian here has been through in different ways.
Can I just add a bit about what I think fiction does that to the explaining the Palestinian context? It's context, context, context for this book. It's the why. Why is it all happening? It's a form of empowerment. See, I'm at a point where I don't really care about what the world thinks of me as a Palestinian. Fuck the world. I'm at a point where need to be in a continual state of reminding myself where this began and how it happened. So obviously the biggest target of any of this criticism, any of these issues have been Hamas, right? And how did Hamas start? Where did Hamas come from? Just as all the other resistance movements within the Palestinian cause, PFLP, Fatah, Hamas, they all started and were founded by people whose villages were obliterated and massacred. So we need to remind ourselves of those people who founded those resistance movements and why they founded them, to fight against what. And they're all different, and they just evolved into different generations of forms of the same original resistance. And to me, it's about that. It's about the purity of the Palestinian cause and why it all started. And these stories help give a context and a reminder of where it all came from and how it all began and how it's continuing to evolve into different shapes and forms of resistance, which as long as the occupation exists, the resistance against it will exist.
Thank you. We are running short of time. One or maybe two last questions very quickly. There is there has been in the UK at least a kind of it's been what can only be described as an orgy of cowardice from institutions. And George, you were talking a little bit about how you're trying to offset the abuses of the institutions that you're working with. And I never thought I would. Comma works a lot with writers, quotes, writers at risk. We've had writers, Kurdish writers in Turkey arrested and things like that, and writers living under so-called oppressive regimes. But I never thought I'd see the day that, I would be writing to an American academic and they would be telling me, please don't use my college email address. Please use my private address. You're being watched, etc., etc. And I just wondered if the situation, and in the UK, we've Commerce had events cancelled and uncancelled and lobbied and attacked and blah 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 blah, and institutionally, there's been silence or almost complete deathly silence from large arts institutions and from universities, like across the board, pretty much. And I just wondered, and it seems to be the case in the US from where we stand, perhaps far worse. And the US publisher of Palestine Plus 100 isn't going to touch a book like this because he gets some grants that he will lose if he publishes it in this prequel book in the US. And I just wondered, is it still as bad as it seemed to be like a year ago, or are things?
Oh God, no, it's getting worse and worse. I mean, again, these other two as well, the them being in journalism, I can't even I can only imagine what Ibtisam has to go through if what I'm going through in academia, because journalism is even worse in some ways, I think, in terms of the censorship. But and of course, Lina at somewhere like NYU, which is also again just yeah, these all these places are just evil, and the masks are all off. But for me, again, I'm just like my responsibility is to the people in Palestine, especially in Gaza right now, and so to me, I'm just like what can they do? They can fire me. Cool. I'll find another job and continue doing the work I'm going to do. They can threaten me and my family. You know what? They already do that. So it's whatever suffering I happens to me at a personal level as a result of refusing to condemn my people or whatever is nothing compared to the suffering of folks in Gaza right now. And so I can't even imagine yeah, just like I have a community, I will figure this out, and it's sad that so many people in the US are just so scared of like losing their job is the worst thing in the fucking world, and it's like and it tells us about people who have not come from loss and who have not come from, but also in the other way too of like colonialism producing scarcity mindsets in us. So the whole, oh, you have to put your head down and survive. And so it's a trap in both directions, I think. And so for me, the best I can do is be strategic and smart about how I resist and just be loud about my values and do my best to keep my loved ones safe, and I don't know, it's a thing where again I'm like how can someone look someone from Gaza in the eyes and when their biggest fear is if they're going to be employed or not, truly have a hard look, and so holding that mirror up to my colleagues here in the US and whatnot, and implicating myself in that too, holding that mirror up to myself, even and whatnot. Yeah, maybe that's something literature can be useful in, at least. I don't know.
Thank
Yeah, I
you.
say very quickly also, I mean, I agree with George, like responsibilities for my people and for what they are going through. And if you don't want, it's not about can't or can, if you don't want to use your voice, even when we go back to the question about literature and the role of literature, if you don't use your voice to advocate, not only for one's own people, but also we live in America with all the what's happening to the native people, to African American, etc. So this is also, we need also to make the connections and see them, because oppressive regimes are also very well connected. And our struggles are connected to these different people. But, I think also part of what literature does is also tell a different and more alternative story to sometimes what the stories of the people, the alternative history and social history of societies, when no one want to look deeper into these stories. And yeah.
Yeah, just to chip in also very, very briefly, I remember Ra and I having that conversation about what email I should use. And then I remember, Ra, that you wrote back to me and said, listen, if you don't want to use your name, that's okay. And I thought, well, I've had like different levels of fear. And then I thought, okay, fear, I don't even feel I have the right to have fear, in the sense that, I mean, nothing would ever be as bad as what is happening to other people. And what started really angering me, and I want to use that word anger, was people who had nothing to do with the Palestinian cause who were also scared. And then I thought, we really need to undo this sort of individualism where we're only thinking about ourselves and our fears and what we might lose, even in terms of like friends who shouldn't really be our friends anymore, um, if they're against us. So I mean, it was an opportunity to really think about, my place in the world, how I think about politics, to what communities do I belong and I want to continue to belong, and ultimately, how do we undo this individualistic notion that has been sort of put into us by all this capitalist thought about success, etc. And so I decided that no, that risk, I mean, if politics has to entail some sort of risk, this idea that you do just a like on Facebook or whatever is not really becoming a political being. If you're going to be involved in the political questions of our time, risk has to be a part of it. And so I did some learning, I have to say, in regards to this.
Thank you, Lina. I think we all did a lot of learning. There was one last question on the chat, which was for people to recommend one book. And you've already mentioned Minor Detail, Adania Shibli, and you've also mentioned Perfect Victim, Mohammed El-Kurd. Are there any? Obviously, I'm going to give a shout out to the Book of Disappearance because it very much fits into this and all of the writers' books. But is there any particular book other than those that anybody wants to give a big shout out to?
He was here in the call earlier, I think, but Salim Haddad's new book, Floodlines, is extraordinary. Just truly, and yeah, just a really, really, really brilliant multi-POV Iraqi family intergenerational story, and yeah, just really, really important. You know, we yeah. Especially the amnesia that American citizens are love to entertain of like how we have not learned from Iraq. And I'm just again holding that up like a mirror to all of them right now and all of our students, and the students are hungry for, they want to read about Iraq, they want to read about Palestine, they want to read about all these contexts. And so as pedagogues, maybe for you all in the chat who are listening, yeah, how can we give our students clearly what they are hungry for is a question I'll leave you all with.
Thank you.
I'd like to recommend a book that is close to my heart, and it's Mossab Abu Toha. I can't just remember the title, but it's something in my ear.
Things you may find hidden in my ear. Yes.
Yeah. I adore that book. It was on my table for a very, very long time. I would come in and out to read those poems because somehow at one point I was just reading poetry, Palestinian poetry, and that book was important to me. And I think it's a very beautiful book.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I agree with George. The Salim Haddad's book novel that came recently is a very beautiful one, and there is an Iraqi literature or even Lebanese literature, and there is an amnesia in this country about what this country did to other places. So what we see in Palestine also did happen. The way the press reporting did happen also about the Iraq war. But I will also recommend the writer, the poet, the Palestinian poet Asma Azazi. She writes really beautifully. And she has a very special voice. And I don't know if she has something in English, like a whole book in English. I think some parts of her poetry was translated to English, but she's really great.
Fantastic. Thank you. And there's some more great suggestions in the chat, and we'll try and put those on the YouTube notes for this when this event, this recording goes up on YouTube. So yeah, it just remains for me to thank everybody. We've sadly run out of time, and to promote Palestine -1. It's available from all good bookshops and also some very bad, evil bookshops as well, if you look really hard. And obviously Comma's website. And yeah, thank you again. Thank you, Ibtisam. Thank you, George. Thank you, Lina and Basma for your contributions to this amazing book. It's one of the books that Basma and I are most proud of, if not the most important book that we've ever done. So thank you so much, and thank you for being part of tonight. And cheers everyone at home.
Cheers.
Bye.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and again, just echoing everyone's thanks for Ra and Basma. Y'all were just, I've never worked with such brilliant and caring editors. Truly, like the amount of shit I put you all through for my story is like I should be like discarded and thrown into a river or something.
Well,
So like, thank you all so much.
And also the translators.
Yeah, of course. Rana Asfour did a fantastic job of it.
Yes, absolutely. He did a great job, and others, like, it's amazing.
Andrea Rosenberg, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Very much.
Yeah.
Bye.